What does the Bible say about systemic racism? Now, this is an incredibly important topic in today's world. Systemic racism is a topic that seems to be all encompassing now, especially in light of all of the racial protests, the proliferation and popularity of Black Lives Matter. We have issues of race have, in one way or another, always been a prominent part of our country. How do we deal with relationships and this going back all the way to the beginning of our history, even regardless of even where you stand on each of those particular issues. Those have always been issues. There have always been important things for us to think about. And they're important for us as Christians to think about because we don't want to be racist. And so when we hear allegations of things like systemic racism, and even that they could be applied to us, we need to think very carefully about them. Is this something that we need to repent of? Or is this something that is in fact wrong, that is not in fact something that's taught in the scriptures? So we need to be very careful in terms of our thinking with regard to these things, and even because there are allegations that systemic racism has infected the church. So the question is, how are Christians supposed to view systemic racism? Is this a concept that is found in the scriptures? This idea that there could be something like a systemic racism as it's propounded today, and is this a problem that the church needs to address? Now, the goal of this "What does the Bible say about" series with regard to systemic racism is that I'm going to tackle it in three parts. So in part one, I'm simply going to define what systemic racism is, to say something about the kinds of arguments that are used to try to prove that something like a systemic racism exists, and then I'm going to offer a biblical critique of it. That'll be this here in part one. In parts 2 and 3, I'm going to look at the ideological foundations that undergird systemic racism and allegations of systemic racism. And this is where it becomes something very important for us as Christians to recognize. We want to think very carefully about race. We, of course, do not want to be racist. We recognize that racism is a sin. And yet, when there are allegations for something like a systemic racism, it is not just coming from nowhere. There are ideological foundations to it, and those foundations are very much contrary to the scriptures. And I think this is where sometimes people don't realize what they're getting themselves into when they posit something like systemic racism and they allege it. It carries with it an entire way of viewing the world. And so in part 2, we're going to look at the systemic racism's relationship to critical race theory, and by extension then neo-Marxism. And then in part 3, we'll look at systemic racism, the allegations of it, and its relationship to postmodernism. The idea, the concept of systemic racism flows from neo-Marxist critical race theory and from postmodernism as well. So going back then, part 1, what is systemic racism? How do people argue for it? And is it biblical? So systemic racism is the idea that all of society, this is very comprehensive, the idea of it being systemic in this sense is that it's comprehensive, is racist. This would be, it could include things like laws, even the culture, jobs, education, basically everything that is institutional and societal is infected with a kind of racism. Now, one of the problems with this is that it often gets related to things in America's past, so particularly racism, racist laws like Jim Crow laws, that sort of things, things that like actually disadvantage black people. There are those arguments that are made. These laws were racist. This is part of a system that's racist. That would be systemic racism. And then also then slavery. Slavery as an institution would have been an example of systemic racism in this view. And so the idea is that there are these parts of a particular system that can be seen, and then there is a straight line that's drawn to today's world, and then the same word, systemic, is used to describe the racism of today. The problem is there's an equivocation with respect to the word systemic. And what I mean by equivocation is you're using the same word, but it means two different things. So in the first case, systemic means something that actually can be seen and it can be tested. So there were laws that were shown to be discriminating against black people. Those were repealed, and there were laws that were put in place that made discrimination on the basis of race to be illegal. So that would be a system in a part of a system that can be seen. You can logically show that it is in fact racist or not racist on the basis of objective criteria. Same thing with slavery. It's an institution that can in fact be seen. The problem is that when the word systemic is used for systemic racism today, it's usually used for things that are largely invisible. So, if you're to ask, well, what are the the laws that are biased against black people. Would be difficult to find them. Even the systems of laws are if anything biased in favor of black people because of things like affirmative action. All things being equal, the law does not give anyone the ability to be advantaged over another unless there is some kind of affirmative action in place. In which case it's the minorities that are privileged above those who are in the majority. So there's no laws, there's no more institution like slavery. Other people say things like there'll be statistics that are given, and this is actually typically a foundational line of argumentation. There's statistics given with regard to inequalities of outcome. So black people don't have the same outcome as white people in this regard. It's a disadvantaged position. Therefore, there's systemic racism. But then when you ask, well, what actual practices within that area of society are racist, it's actually difficult to define what they are. They seem not to exist. You at least can't show what they are. And so in today's version of systemic racism, as it is alleged, so the idea is that all of society is infected with systemic racism, there has to be another aspect of this that's brought in, another part of this, and that concept that's brought in is the concept of implicit bias. So the idea here is that even though there may not be any laws that are explicitly racist, there may be no practices that we can point to that are explicitly racist. Even if then most white people do not ever act on racist principles, yet there still could be a systemic racism that permeates all of society, and this is because of implicit bias. So implicit bias is the idea that on the subconscious level. So here, implicit bias is not even a conscious thing; it's a subconscious thing that people are in general. And probably more than in general, are always implicitly biased in favor of their own ethnicity and against another ethnicity. And what's important for our country and our particular situation, and even the way it's usually applied, is the oppressing class, so to speak, is the one that has implicit bias against the oppressed class, which means that whites have implicit bias against blacks. And this can be so subtle that it may not be the case that even most white people act on this implicit bias. It may not even be the case that people know they have an implicit bias. And yet we're told in this view that every single person without fail has this implicit bias. And so then when we try to account for the differences between blacks and whites, one, there is an assumption that the only possible explanation for such a difference is racism, that there's no other possible explanation. And then two, if you were to say, well, where is the racism that's causing all these differences? The answer is there is implicit bias that even though it does not manifest itself often, and maybe in an individual person it may never manifest itself, the fact that millions and millions of people have the exact same implicit bias means that overall the system is going to be skewed in favor of white people against black people. That's the idea behind implicit bias. So even if someone never acts on it, even if they never know about it, the fact that it is there, and it is assumed to be there for everybody, so there's no way to get around that. The fact that it is there in this view means that there is a systemic oppression against black people, even if you can't point to even a thought that you have that's racist. So that's the idea of systemic racism. Now, there are a number of just logical problems with positing something like systemic racism. The first is, as I mentioned, there is an assumption that the only possible explanation for differences of outcome is due to racism, that there's no other possible explanation. And so there are all kinds of examples that we could look at, but I want to look at only one here, and that is the example of police brutality. And this is particularly important in light of all the protests that happened last year and in the summer of 2020, everything that happened with Black Lives Matter. This led as well to rioting and looting. 90 days plus in Portland, they declared a riot. There was an autonomous zone that declared itself separate from the United States that came in Seattle. There was over $2 billion of property damage. There were people in Chicago that were bringing U-Hauls into the city in order to loot stores. There were more people that died in the first 2 months of the protests than in all of 2019 of unarmed black men at the hands of police. More people died in the first 2 months of the protest than in all of 2019 who were unarmed black men at the hands of police. So there were quite these things were quite serious in terms of the level of zeal that people were fighting against this supposed systemic racism, and it all stemmed from police brutality. So the idea is like, here's Exhibit 1A of systemic racism, that the police are systemically racist and they are targeting black people. That's the idea. Now, what would be the data that would support it? What would be the lines of argumentation? Well, we're told, and this is true, that per capita, there are going to be each year more black people that die at the hands of police than white people. So per capita, in this regard, you'd say if you just randomly selected, black or white person, there's a better chance of a black person being killed from the police than a white person. Now, this is true. However, as I mentioned, one of the key lines of argumentation that is really an assumption in order to prove systemic racism is that this difference of outcome must be attributed to racism, and there is no other possible explanation for it, such that simply the statistic of more black people dying per capita at the hands of police than white people proves systemic racism. That's typically the way the arguments work. Inequality of outcome means there was racism somewhere. The problem is that there's actually a very easy explanation for the difference, and just in terms of cause and effect, it explains even more than all of the data. I mean, the idea is that it goes, it would actually show that in terms of demographic interaction with police, the most advantageous position in terms of statistics would be if you were a black person who is interacting with a white police officer. You have actually the least likely chance of dying in that case. You actually have a greater chance of dying if you are a white person interacting with a black police officer. Now, in both cases, it's extraordinarily rare that there would be even any kind of violence in a police interaction. And if you adjust for, like resisting arrest or things like that, it falls basically to zero. But regardless, the idea here, this one factor is the fact that there is more crime that's committed in the black community than in the white community. So the black community accounts for 12% of the population, and yet over half the murders each year and over half the burglaries each year. If this were the case, you would expect then that over half of the police interactions would be with black people. So already there would be an assumption that, if every interaction with a police officer were equal, then there is probably going to be more deaths from police officers of black people at the hands of police officers than white people, because there are more black people that encounter police officers. So there's more interactions between them because of the crime that's committed. But we actually find that when you adjust for this basic fact, that it's actually far and away not the case. More than twice the number of white people, unarmed, died at the hands of police in 2019 than black people. 19, and again, so you can just see how incredibly low these numbers are. 19 unarmed white people in 2019 died at the hands of police, and 9 black people died who were unarmed at the hands of police in 2019. So 19 to 9, and yet black people actually had over half of the interactions with police, if we just extrapolate this out from the statistics of crimes that are committed. And so in this way, again, the bias is actually in favor of black people. And the reason for this is because in today's world, there is an incredible amount of caution that you would have to have if you were a white police officer interacting with a black person. If you are in a situation where you have to pull the trigger, even if you're justified, you could be charged with murder. You could lose your job. It seems like almost likely that you'll lose your job, even if it's justified. Even before there's any chance of exoneration, that could happen. Your name will be all over the news, perhaps even for months. You could even receive threats for your family. There's all kinds of things that can happen. A lot of negative publicity, even if you're just a regular police officer. And yet, if it's reversed, if a black cop pulls the trigger on a white person, you'll never know either of their names. And in fact, there are more than double in 2019 unarmed white men who died at the hands of police than black people. But we know all the names of all the black people, and we know none of the names of any of the white people. And so this just shows there's a kind of narrative that's trying to be put forward that is in fact not in accordance with statistics or facts at all. And even the idea of the the uh, increased levels of crime in the black community, even that can be explained in ways that have nothing really to do with racism at all. And this is simply the fact that for decades now, the nuclear family, the biblical view of the family, has been deteriorated and undermined within the black community, such that now, over 70% of children in the black community are born without a father. Now, if this was the case for any ethnicity, if this was the case for white people, you'd have the exact same result. So there would be an increased amount of crime. And even we see the number of children born out of wedlock in the white community has increased quite a lot as well. And so all of these things are being undermined, and all of them are hurting society. It is a sad reality that it is deteriorating in the black community faster. Now, the problem with this is this view of systemic racism. If you buy into this idea of systemic racism with regard to police brutality, it greatly affects the kind of solutions you seek. So, for instance, Black Lives Matter, the solution that was proposed was we need less police officers. Now, that would certainly be a good solution if police were targeting black people. However, if they're not targeting black people, and if the problem is more that there is an increased crime in these communities, then if you are a law-abiding black citizen, then the thing that you need more than anything else is not decrease in police, but you actually need an increase in police, such that then the allegation of systemic racism actually causes harm to the black community, because the solution that is consistent with this kind of allegation actually leads to a greater problem within the black community. That is that there will be less police, which means crime will go up even higher. And even we see this with regard to what causes the crime. So if you say that if we say that the foundation of every society biblically is the family, that there is to be the family as a unit is to grow up and to fear the Lord as a unit. And if this is then undermined, then this will cause great problems in society. What we see, even with Black Lives Matter, and even all of those who would posit systemic racism, this is typically something that goes right along with it, is there is an undermining of the value of the nuclear family, something that's been going on for decades in the black community. And so we have with Black Lives Matter then, the allegation of systemic racism comes with it an undermining of the nuclear family, which increases poverty and it increases crime. And we also have the proposed solution of decreasing the number of police officers in these areas, which also increases crime. And this is all based on an allegation of systemic racism that has many logical problems with it. Now, if we look at then a biblical critique of this, even this we see is not consistent with a biblical view of justice at all. In the Bible, justice is supposed to be colorblind. It's class blind. It's everything blind. The only thing that matters is the action that's done, and was there an appropriate response to that action. So, for instance, in Exodus 21 through 23, Moses lays out what's typically called the covenant code, a number of laws that the Israelites are to abide by. And one of the principles is, the idea of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The idea is that the punishment for a crime must match the crime. And later on, Moses will say that this is to be the case whether or not the person is poor. So you're not to be biased in favor of a poor person in your lawsuit. You're also not to be biased in favor of a rich person in your lawsuit. There is to be nothing, is the idea. There's to be no class distinction with regard to justice. In this sense, there's no social justice in the sense of someone being advantaged or disadvantaged before the law because of some kind of social factor. The only thing that matters is the thing which is done. And now this is something that's quite undermined with the allegation of systemic racism. We're talking about something that is unconscious. With the idea of implicit bias, there's no laws that recognize this. It's simply a ghost that can't be detected. And yet we're told that this is the basis of an oppression on a group of people that's so extreme that they really can't succeed unless this problem is dealt with. It's difficult to even see how the problem could be dealt with if it's we're talking about unconscious thoughts or unconscious things within somebody. But even here, if we go back to the idea of applying biblical justice to the area of, say, police brutality and interactions with people, implicit in the allegation of systemic racism is that the black community particularly those who are committing the crimes. Implicitly, they are victims rather than perpetrators. They're the victims. So those who are committing the crimes are victims. And then we saw this particularly with the Black Lives Matter protests. By polling, the majority of people believed that black people were justified in looting, rioting. Even some of the violence was justified because of the oppression that they've received. So because they're in a class that has been oppressed at some point, then that excuses an act which is against the law, which, or if you were to think about it in spiritual terms, is sinful. And this would be contrary to the biblical view of justice. There's no society that can stand on such principles. There has to be some kind of rule of law and some kind of justice that's reflective of God's objective standard. And so not only does this have problems for society, though, it also has problems with regard to the gospel as well. If a society is unwilling to recognize its own sins, or the individuals within it are unwilling to recognize their own sins and want to claim that the things that they do that are sinful are in fact justified because they belong to an oppressed class, which again, we'll actually get into this more in parts 2 and 3 with regard to the ideological underpinnings of this. But if someone claims that, then they will have an inability to see that they are a sinner in need of repentance. They're a sinner in need of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ to be forgiven of their sins. A victim cannot receive the same kind of thing from Christ that a sinner does. The requirement to come to Christ is that you understand that you are in fact a sinner. And this is undermined with the allegation of systemic racism. The sin is from the oppressing class, and it's never from the victim side. And again, this part we'll actually get into more in part 2 as we look at critical race theory. But overall, the idea of systemic racism is fraught with many problems. The allegation itself is often illogical. It's contrary to the biblical view of justice. And as we'll see in parts 2 and 3, it actually carries with it very dangerous ideological underpinnings. So we'll look at that in the coming weeks.